Greetings and salutations. Welcome to this episode of Playwright Spotlight. Before we begin, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below, even if it's just to say hi. Apparently, it helps our algorithm. Also, if you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. My guest today is an active composer for musical theater. His children's show, Super Sidekick the Musical, is published by Samuel French and Concord Theatricals and has been performed in front of young audiences throughout the United States, including Off-Broadway in 2012. His family musicals, Gideon and the Blundersnorp and the Bully Problem, have won numerous awards and nominations, including, for Gideon, Best Musical at the 2021 Hollywood Fringe Festival. He's a graduate of the acclaimed film scoring program at the University of Southern California and studied at the ASCAP Film Scoring Seminar. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Gordon Shapiro. Thanks for coming on the Playwright Spotlight, sir.
Pleased to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So, how do you even start writing a musical? And do you write the songs first and then develop the play around them? I mean, how do you do this?
Yeah, I have really strong opinions in this area, and they aren't obvious opinions. They're things, ideas I developed over years of practice. I'm a strong believer in start with the story where musical theater is concerned. I think you really need to have a substantially solid story before you really start the songwriting process. I like to say that if you start writing the music before you've got your book, it's like buying the furniture before you know where you're going to live. You just don't know that the content you're creating has a home.
For those, because I'm ignorant when it comes to this, the musical theater is just not, it's not my forte, if you will. When you refer to the book, and this came up in a couple episodes back with Kimberly Faye Greenberg when she was talking about her one-woman show, Fanny Bryce. But when you're talking about the book, what does that mean exactly?
It's just musical theater lingo for the script when considered separately from the songs and lyrics.
Got it. Okay, and then so go back to your process of like where you begin. You said know the story first. Do you know that you're writing a musical beforehand most of the time, or do you do both? Or you just strictly do musicals?
I pretty much just do musical theater. I've dabbled in occasional short straight plays, but by and large, I'm coming from the perspective of a composer because before I was writing musicals, and I still am writing underscore for games and film. So I approach things from a music first perspective, and I've always been really interested in musicals. Which might make it strange that I put so much emphasis on the book, because many composers like to jump in with the music and then kind of figure out the book later. But I've kind of become a book absolutist, story first, and then figure out how the music's going to work.
Okay, so go into that process. Go into the when you sit down, when you come up with an idea, and we'll get into how you come up with those ideas. When you decide I'm gonna do a musical. You sit down, you've come up with your idea, and what's your first step?
Well, there are two basic ways I can go about the process. One is if I'm collaborating with someone. You had Greg Crafts on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he and I collaborated on Super Sidekick the Musical. And that's one methodology. For that project, Greg provided the story. And my job was to look at the story and ask, how can this be musicalized? And when you're starting with a pre-existing story, what you're looking for are these key moments, these emotionally powerful moments, decisions, strong actions, changing of somebody's mind or persuading somebody from one position to another. You look for these points, and those are the points that invariably become songs. And fortunately, Greg's play, what he started with a straight play, was chock full of these moments, these really fun, active moments that music could fit in very easily. So when working with a collaborator, I look for these points in the story, and then I say, get ready to sandblast your beloved script, because we need to carve out some of what you've written and replace it with music. A very important point that's also not obvious is that in a well-written musical, the music is part of the storytelling. You don't want to just have a complete story and then just drop in songs where characters reflect on what just happened or just express their feelings about what's going to happen. You really want the story's key emotional action to happen during songs. So if I'm starting with somebody else's or pre-existing story, part of my job is to transform or help transform these moments into music. And that might involve some degree of rethinking. It might involve taking dialogue and figuring out how to lyricize it. And occasionally it might be saying, can you change X to Y? Because that way we'll have more of a musical moment. So that's kind of the collaborative paradigm for me.
So I get that aspect and the collaborative aspect. Do you take that same approach with your own work? Like when you're writing something, and then you get to the point where there's a song, it's like, all right, I got to take a chunk out of this point because this is going to be in the song now. And so do you still take that same approach with your own work when you're not collaborating?
Yeah, absolutely. The only difference is I have to first write the story before I can go and excavate parts of it to become music. But my method is to first write a very strange play with no music and lyrics that's a little different from a regular play because it'll be perhaps a little more, character motivations will be a little further on the surface than you'd expect in a play. You know, there's not a lot of depth is a poor choice of words. Motivations are very clear. Character identities are clear. It's a kind of very over the top, very evident kind of story. So I write a play basically knowing that I'm going to return to that and then musicalize it afterwards. But the reason this is important is before I can really decide where the songs go, I just need to see the story structure for myself. So I don't completely turn off my composer brain, but I put it aside. I put it on the sideline. I let it heckle. I let it say, hey, that's going to be a good music spot. Just keep that in mind. But by and large, I shift into a writer mode where I just really think about the story in terms of spoken language.
In that aspect, do your songs break the fourth wall most of the time? Are they always interactive between two other characters? When does that come into play?
I think it's common in musicals for there to be some breaking of the fourth wall. If ever a character in a musical turns to the audience and just starts singing directly at the audience, we don't think of that as what's literally happening. It's more of a metaphor for the character thinking out loud, reflecting to themselves. But of course, it wouldn't look very exciting if they just turned and stared into the distance. So we have this convention of singers singing to the audience. So in that sense, it can be thought of as breaking the fourth wall. But in musicals, the fourth wall is a little bit loosey-goosey to begin with, right? Sure. That inviolate boundary between audience and character is less rigid than I think it would be in a straight play.
You mentioned when you kind of touched on when you decide that your characters are gonna break into song. So can you go through that as well? Like when those moments are, right? You said an emotional aspect. Are there any other times when they want to get something across, or my guess is probably not for exposition, though I guess that's one thing it could be used for song, but.
Exposition is very important. I mean, typically in a musical, the first song introduces you to the world of the show or the central theme or the central idea. Tradition, is a perfect example. They just tell you straight out, this is a show about tradition. Sure. In Fiddler on the Roof. So exposition is definitely an important function for a song in a musical. But where the money shot really lies are what I'll call character moments of strong emotional evaluation. A character saying, I really like this, or I hate this, or I'm changing my mind about this, or I have to make a decision about this. To me, songs are most effective when they're active, when something is happening during them, when there's some change to the world, and when we, the audience, know something at the end of the song that we didn't know going in. What I tend to like less are songs that are purely reflective, where a character says, oh, I just said goodbye to my girlfriend, and now I'm sad, and here I am singing for 4 minutes about how sad I am. Because, the action's already happened. What's there really to sink our teeth into as audience members if everything good has just happened in dialogue, and now there's just this musical postscript?
Are there known musicals that that do that, or that you just... What's a great example of a musical with all those things that you just touched on, and what's a really good example of a bad musical of those things that you just touched on.
Right. I do hate to impugn my colleagues, but Hamilton is remarkably good at having active songs. There is the occasional song that's reflective, like I think Burn. That's kind of a classic lament. And as a side note, you can have the occasional reflective song that's just meant to immerse you in the moment and the emotional truth of the character. But Hamilton is very good at imbuing the songs with action, with change. And the story is very active to begin with. So if you think of numbers like Right Hand Man or the Battle of Yorktown, or the numbers where his rivals are plotting against him. Even the songs we love the most, there tends to be something going on in them. And it's for that reason that I think the show feels so compelling, because there's action, there's activity, there's stakes. You really feel like things are going to be different when the song is over most of the time. If I think of a musical that doesn't do a great job at this, well, a beloved example that is deliberately contrarian is Company by Stephen Sondheim. And here you have a main character who's very passive and reflective. It's really more of a review than a book musical. Some of the songs have some romantic implications and decisions. They're active in the sense that a character goes in thinking they're going to get married, and then they're not. But none of it really impacts the main character. He's just a sponge. It's another good example. I think Spring Awakening is a great example of a show with great music in terms of it being just fun to listen to, but the songs have a very strange and disconnected relationship to what's going on in the story. I think there's a good cautionary tale if you want to think of that as something that had such a successful Broadway run. But I think if we look at it dramaturgically, I think there are a lot of lessons about what not to do.
Do you have a composer or musicals that inspire you that you try to strive to emulate, or
yeah, of course,
that you draw upon?
Yeah, I divide musicals into guilty pleasures, shows that I love or like, and then the rest. Guilty pleasure-wise, I grew up listening to Jesus Christ Superstar, and yes, the story has kind of a Deus Ex Machina built into it, so there's and spoilers for most audience members, but there is something compelling about just the drive of that show and how it relentlessly moves from A to B to C, and how there's this rise and fall of essentially a sect, and you get this experience and this commentary on the relationship between movements and the leader figures in those movements. It's for all its reliance on well-known backstory, it's a really great experience. Another guilty pleasure is chess. I will go on at length about how flawed the show is, but it just also packs a great emotional punch, and the score is magnificent. It's enveloping. I love that show, even though I'm slightly embarrassed to love that show. I think looking at other role models that are structurally a little more mature, I've already mentioned Hamilton. I think Waitress is a really well-written show, and it's also very entertaining. Some musicals are fun, and some musicals are satisfying stories, and Waitress is a great example of something that's both. And there's a really awesome integration of storytelling and music. Just even sometimes in the details of the contours of the song, where if a character is being emotionally overcome, the melody line will kind of be subdued and drop to a lower interval. There's all these there's loving attention to detail. So that's a good example of a contemporary show that's not necessarily striving for high art, but is done so well that I think it's a good challenge to anyone working in a contemporary musical idiom.
Okay. So you said guilty pleasure, and then what were the other two?
Shows that I like, that I think are structurally or well written. Yeah.
Thank you. So what's the most important factor when it comes to a character's song?
Well, from the standpoint of music, it's very subjective and very individualistic. Everyone has their own musical tastes. Some people will like a powerful ballad like Defying Gravity with these soaring high notes. other people might like their music. I mean, they may lean more towards hip hop. They may lean towards something more naturalistic. So it's hard to come up with rules where we're talking about musical taste. But if you think of in terms of writing,
then that's what I should have been more clear. That's exactly so. When I'm coming from the aspect from you as either the composer, the lyricist, for lack of a better word, I don't know if that's correct, or the playwright itself. When you go into writing the song, what are the most important things that you need to touch on, or how do you?
Sure. You want to start by asking yourself, why is there a song here? What function does that song play? And as I alluded earlier, if you find you're just reacting to something that happened, repeating something the audience already knows, needlessly introducing yourself when we already know who you are, things like that, those are pitfalls to avoid. I look for moments where there is some kind of strong psychological action, a decision, a realization, and above all, some kind of change, some difference in the character from start to finish. Now, as said, you can have the occasional reflective song. There's no rule saying you can't, but the songs that are really going to linger during the audience are the ones where there's just some dynamite change or action happening in the music itself, and the music is the way that action happens in the story.
Let me touch on that then. And so when it comes to a solo, is that, and we'll use dramatic aspects in that regard in traditional playwriting. Would you say it's correct that solos are internal conflict, whereas a duet, would that always constitute external conflict between those two characters?
It's an interesting question. I've never thought of it in those terms. Let me try to improvise an answer for you. I'm thinking now of Defying Gravity. That's a song that represents both inner and external conflict. Elphaba's trying to decide, how does she get over the fact that her idol turned out to be a bad person, and does she have confidence to strike out on her own when she imagined her life as essentially an apprentice? So there's this internal decision, and how does she turn against Glinda? But there's also external action because she flies. Wow, that's something we all remember from that moment. So I think it's ideal if you can somehow combine inner and external conflict in a song and tie them together thematically in terms of story theme. I think that can give you incredibly powerful moments. But that said, a powerful internal conflict can really be substantive for a song. If a character is making a decision, I think that's a great example. Jean Valjean in Les Mis deciding, I'm not going to let this person go to jail for my crime. Yes, there is an external action, the way it's staged at the end, where you see him kind of reveal his identity and now he's in trouble. But the real action of the song happened internally, where he said, well, gee, the bishop told me to be a good person, and here's a real conundrum. I can be a good person, but I'd be revealing myself as a wanted criminal. And he goes through all of this rumination, and he ultimately makes the right choice. He decides to not let an innocent person go to jail for him. So I guess that's another case of both internal and external conflict. But I think in that case, the internal conflict is the more interesting one.
Okay, and then so when you're doing it, I mean, do you take those things into account, or how do you approach the lyrics of a piece in that regard when you're either making that decision or that struggle? How do you come up with the lyrics and the appropriate words, and how are you implementing rhythm and I don't want to say melody, but meter, for lack of a better phrase?
There's quite a bit packed in there, so let me try to
take your time and break it down as you way.
So, let's see, what's the first part of that? Lyrics. Well, speaking generally, you imagine you're a playwright and you're looking at a scene, and you might ask yourself, what's happening in the scene? Like, what's important here? What is the dramatic action? The lyric, the central lyric, the refrain or chorus lyric, should be the answer to that. It should be telling you what's happening in essential terms and in poetic terms.
Can you expand on that? Because I've heard the phrase refrain and all that, and in probably the musicals that I've done back in the day, it's been a while.
Sure.
I'm rusty, and so maybe somebody who also may not be familiar with this aspect of playwriting will explain what that is.
Yeah, sure, no problem. The refrain, in very informal terms, is just the lyric that you're going to hear over and over again as a recurring motive, a repeated phrase. It may be adapted, it may be recontextualized, but it's the thing that we think of as the main lyric of the song.
Is that the same as the chorus?
Sure. It may not literally be the chorus, but in formal terms, yeah, it's the chorus.
Okay.
Defying gravity, right? She says that over and over again, and it refers to the fact that she's both fighting this pessimism because her idol turned out to be a false idol, and she's literally defying gravity in that she's flying. So that's a great case of a lyric, a refrain with multiple meanings. It's not it doesn't require a PhD to be able to do what it's referring to, but it's a nice, clever way of representing the action of the scene on multiple levels at once. So ideally, a lyric is going to just tell you what is happening in the song. What is the person going through, the refrain? And it'll try to encapsulate it in a phrase or an expression that's memorable and has a rhythmic identity that matches music.
And then is there a structure to that you recommend? Like first, I'm going to say stanza, and I know that's not right. Refrain, second stanza, refrain
Stanza's
again.
Fine, sure.
Okay, so, I mean, is there a structure? Is there a structure in that regard?
Well, yeah. And it
that
depends.
You kind of adhere to in every song, or?
You have to ask yourself what's happening in the song, and in turn, what's happening in the scene, and why is the song here, and what is the big change? And once you've got that, that will determine what your lyric. I'm trying to think of maybe some example from. Okay, so here's a family friendly example. In Super Sidekick, the hero is an assistant superhero, and he is tasked with rescuing his boss, the real superhero, or so we think. So he sets out on his own, and he's used to being the right-hand man, the sidecar, and now suddenly he's got to step up and be the hero. So there's a song called I'm Not Afraid of the Dark. And this is all about him convincing himself that it's a persuasion song, but the persuasion is directed at himself. He's saying, I've got what it takes to navigate this scary cave full of monsters. It's dark, literally and figuratively, and I've never done this before, and yet I'm going to give myself this self-affirmation and give myself the courage. I'm going to believe in myself so I can get from A to B and rescue my boss. So he repeats, I'm not afraid of the dark. And it starts out kind of like wishful thinking. He's saying it like he wants to believe it. And during the course of the song, he thinks a little bit about all the dangers that are waiting for him, and he kind of freaks himself out. And by the end, he has a little bit of a chase, and he comes to the conclusion, yeah, I can do this. I can be, even if right now I'm afraid of the dark, I can aspire to not be afraid of the dark. I can do what I need to do, even if I am afraid of the dark. He goes through a physical journey, running away from monsters, but also an emotional journey of self-belief and demonstration in his own worth. So that very simple refrain, which was written to be digestible by 5 to 8 year olds if necessary, just kind of tells you what the song is about. It's a little kid trying to get through a dark and scary cave. And my hope was that lyric would convey the idea and evoke the scene. The details all describe the process of him contemplating what was around him. There's demons out there and dragons and all this stuff I'm afraid of, but you know what? Never mind. I'm not afraid of the dark. So the non-refrain is sort of the contrast object. It's kind of like, here are all the things I realize that are out here in the dark, but nope, I'm not afraid of it. So that's how the lyrics demonstrate his mindset and take us through this song, simple as it is.
It's listening to that, and I don't know if this is the case, so I'm kind of curious that kind of like any play, any story that you're watching, there's an arc. Would you say that every song in a musical has its own arc?
Ideally. In reality, not always. Sometimes songs end up being repetitive, just soaking us in a moment. And as I said, you can have an occasional reflective, passive song, but I think ideally there is an arc to every song. There's some kind of change in progression so that the third chorus means something different than the second chorus, which means something different than the first chorus. Even if they're singing the same lyric, ideally it will be imbued with more meaning because of some change that happened during the song. And to go back to the Wicked example, the fact that Elphaba jumps in the air and literally flies to the end, that's a great way to differentiate that chorus from the ones beforehand. Before she's doing it, she's contemplating defying gravity, right? I forget the exact lyrics, but it's kind of, suppose I try defying gravity. It's subjective. It's subjunctive? What's that term?
Subjective?
Subjunctive. She's contemplating defying gravity. And at the end, she does it, right? So there's a really clear arc there. And I think the best theater songs have that kind of progression.
If somebody who wants to write a musical but has no musical background, for lack of a better word, I was going to say use talent, but so they've written their play, they've written their songs, but they have no...
Well, they're done. Congratulations.
Well, sure. Well, when I say songs, I mean their lyrics, but they have no anything behind their music whatsoever. I mean, do you recommend, especially because it's, they're going to find a composer, do you recommend them just leaving the songs alone until they can collaborate with somebody, or at least have a basis? How do you approach that from somebody who's, I want to do this, but I don't have a musical background on how to compose this?
Well, I'll turn to practical advice rather than highfalutin theory. It really depends how much of a lyricist your composer is. If they're not a lyricist, then you, the playwright, may end up taking on the burden of writing lyrics. And that can be a heavy burden because you really want to then think in terms of poetic rhythm. You want to make sure that there is a perceivable meter, that there's something the composer can work with. If you're working with a composer who's also a lyricist, you may reconsider how much detail you put into the lyrics that you give that composer, because they may be better equipped to change the lyrics or adapt to the lyrics or maybe even write them, because they are working hands-on with the raw material of the music. So I think as a practical matter, give your composer permission to adjust the lyrics, to musicalize them, to paraphrase. Say, like, you can tell them this turn of phrase is super important, I'd love to use this, but otherwise you could say, here's the general idea of where I want the song to go. In your own words, with your own music, find a way to lyricize that. Well, keep the essence of my idea, but don't feel beholden to all the details. I think from a practical, collaborative standpoint, that is a really good way to proceed, because it gives the composer breathing room. It lets them not feel shackled to the meter of the lyrics that somebody may have written.
In that next step, then, if you don't have a composer, you don't have that connection, what do you recommend? How do you recommend they go discover that person, find that person?
Well, it's kind of like finding a spouse or finding a therapist. It's a long-term relationship.
You're saying go to a bar?
Well done. Yeah, do the opposite of that. You really want to think long-term. If you're doing a short musical, and sidebar, I generally recommend beginners start with short musicals. You can be a little more freewheeling in how you find a collaborator because the stakes aren't that high and the duration of the collaboration isn't that long. But if you're on your dream project, your 2.5 hour epic musical about the Treaty of Westphalia or whatever, stories near and dear to your heart, you really want to find, I think you want to figure out what your opinions are first. Who are your favorite theater composers? What style of music is calling out to you for this particular to be made into a musical? And find role model composers. And when you're talking to prospective composers, just say, send me your music, send me the things that are most you, the kind of songs that you most want to write, that most speak to you personally. Find out what that person is about. I think everyone has more opinions about music than they realize. So if they start out saying, I just need a composer, they will find rapidly that they actually want a very specific kind of composer, but they didn't know it yet. So don't be afraid to interview candidates until you find one that artistically feels like they're in the right place, and that you get a good collaborative vibe from, because that's, as with a spouse, that's super important. You need someone you can work with.
How much experience do you think that you should be looking for somebody who, as far as their CV or resume goes?
Well, if you're on your first musical, I would, if you're a playwright on your first, working on the project that you want to be your first musical, find a composer with more experience than you have. Let them guide you. Definitely find someone who can collaborate. I'm not saying find a terror, of someone with a huge ego and an authorial instinct where they override what you're doing. No, find someone who vibes, but get someone who's been through the process so that you're not both learning. Unless it's a learning project, unless you're doing something for the purpose of just getting your feet wet and seeing what it's like.
Is there any story that can't be turned into a musical?
Yeah, I think lots and lots of stories don't elegantly lend themselves to musicals. I think musicals have more rules than people realize. And it's the principles of musical theater were hashed out during the golden age of Broadway, forged by the relentless judgment of Broadway audiences. People found out what worked, what connected to audiences. And many of the cliches and traditions in musical theater that we sometimes ridicule as over the top, it turns out that they were established for a very important reason. So, I think I instead of saying what story couldn't be made into a musical, which is kind of a dare, right? Like if I throw out, like, no one could make a musical about a documentary on vegetables, someone will find a way to do it. I'll turn that around and say what a musical should have is a central character that we can root for, somebody whose values and goals we can get behind in some way. That's the most important thing a musical has to have. It doesn't mean that we have to like them in real life terms. Like none of us would like Sweeney Todd if we ran into him in an alleyway. We would run away, right? We don't want to hang with that guy. But we absolutely sympathize with his need for justice. We all have been there. So you want a character that we are on board with. And if you don't have that, you'll be floundering the entire time. If you do have a character who you can sympathize with, you're really in good shape. You've got the first important component down. And then from a storytelling perspective, you need a story where the outcome is a function of your main character's decisions. And here is where I break from people who love musicals like Company, naturalistic shows where characters just kind of drift. I think those are very boring. I think you need a story with an active character that's some way goal-driven, and they take some action to get whatever it is that they want, and they don't necessarily need to get what they set out to get. They may discover halfway through the show, oh, what I thought I wanted isn't actually what I need. And that's fine. I mean, there's a long tradition of shows like that. The important thing is that at any point in the story, you can look at the main character and say, okay, I know what that person needs right now. And you can journey with them emotionally so that when they sing, your spirit resonates with theirs. And that's the quality I think a musical has to have.
You mentioned there are rules when it comes to musical theater. There are more rules to musical theater than we realize. What are some more of those rules?
Well, I outlined a couple. The idea of,
Are there any others?
Let's see what's important. In addition to being on the side of your main character, I think you need a certain consistency of focus on the main character. A pitfall that I think into which many beginners tend to stumble is what I sometimes call musical democracy, which is the providing of songs for all the characters in the show, figuring every character needs to have some song, and we're going to set up a situation where they can take their moment in the spotlight and sing. And I think when this happens, it's done for the most benevolent of reasons. I think a writer or director or whoever's commissioning the story says, I'd love for all the actors to feel like they had a musical moment. And I think this often backfires because we, the audience, can only care about so much for that 90 minutes or 120 minutes, however long we're going to be there. We've got a limited supply of care, of careness. And if it gets spread out too thin, we start to disengage. So to turn that into a rule, I think not only do we need a main character that we connect with, but we need to be pretty focused on that main character most of the time. Again, this is not an obvious rule. I think a lot of people write shows with the best of intentions where the audience kind of drifts off in Act Two because suddenly all these secondary characters are wrapping up their subplots and they're singing their songs, and we're kind of like, yeah, when are we getting back to the main character? You know, we run out of the ability to care if we're given too many people's plights at once. So I think central character focus is another important unwritten rule of musicals.
Is there a specific length that a song should be?
No, I don't think so. I think form follows function here. The length of the song, like all other factors of the music, really depend on what's going on in the story. You might have a big, epic 12-minute song with interstitial dialogue and refrains and a fake ending that turns out just to be, you know, the landing on a long ascending staircase. Or you might have like just a 2 or 3 minute little comedic number meant to revitalize our spirits after we just listened to that long 12-minute song. So there are no hard and fast rules in terms of the structure of music. There's just the abstract principle that it should reinforce the story.
You mentioned pitfalls a little bit ago. What were some of the pitfalls that you ran into? Did you recognize them at first? How did you overcome them? Were you in denial? Is some beginning writers or even actors, you know, they're just like, no, this is right. I know I'm right. You know, did you have any moments like that? Were you stubborn? Did it take a little bit for you to realize?
Yes and no. There's definitely a long period when I've developed musicals where what happened wasn't what I expected. But I don't necessarily think it was because I was particularly stubborn or in denial. I just don't think you really understand what your musical is like until you see it and hear it, or you see and hear a workshop or some other approximation of the show. You need to see it on its feet. You need to hear it live and breathe, and you just need to hear the music sung to you by actors before you really get a sense of whether or not it's working. So there have definitely been times when I thought, I thought this character would be a riot, but he's coming across as a sarcastic jerk. Better change that. Or
is that because of you, or is that because maybe that was that particular performer wasn't just getting the layers?
It would be nice to blame everything on the performers. That would be great for my ego. But it's very rare where a performer was so off base that the essence of my song didn't come across. I just start by blaming myself. I say, what was I trying to do? What assumption were I making? And how did this not meet those assumptions? And if you approach the dramaturgy of your show with a little bit of modesty in the face of the unknowable swirling vortex of musicals, this weird experience that we never fully understand until we see it, and if you can maintain a kind of flexibility, you'll be in good shape for the rewrite process.
So most playwrights, there's always like, I'm going to get a group of friends together and just sit around and listen or hear my piece when it comes to regular play, or else I'll do a stage reading. So, but what do you recommend for musical theater playwrights? How do they go about that same thing of I don't necessarily know if is it still a staged reading? How does that go?
Sure.
How do you do it?
Well, as said, I will start with a story. I'll write a play, basically a play with a big asterisk saying music to be added here. And I'll typically gather some actors around, and we'll sit in my living room, and I'll hand out scripts, and I'll give a little bit of character information. And I'll tell people this is a kind of a blueprint of a musical without music. But I still think that hearing a reading just of your dialogue will be informative and useful.
Interesting.
Yeah, you'll get a sense of pacing. What you won't get a sense of is how the music is going to convey the emotional truth of this story, but you will get a sense of what the story's like. And things like, do I know what my main character wants? Am I on board with what I want? Can I sympathize with that character? Is their journey coherent? Halfway through this to be a musical, am I losing track of what they want? And am I getting bored? Are they acting consistently? Like all the things that a straight playwright, a non-musical playwright cares about, you can flush those out at the script reading stage. And I will typically iterate through that once or twice. At a certain point where I feel like the story is in good shape, I'll then start the songwriting process and start integrating the music into the story. And I said that will involve tearing out chunks of story and maybe even rethinking the story, because I realize, oh, this just doesn't work from a musical perspective. So now I had two options for the scene, A or B. B works really well with music. I had A, now I'm switching. So a second round of changes will happen when I'm at the musicalization phase. So to actually answer your question, at some point, it is very valuable to do a musicalized workshop of your work. I mean, you need to do it at some point. I've been lucky enough to work with an organization called New Musicals, Inc. here in, actually very close to where we are sitting right now in North Hollywood. And they have been very supportive in providing the opportunities to workshop my shows. And the way these will manifest is they'll just be actors on a stage with scripts and music stands. And they will step up to the music stand when it's time to sing. There'll usually be a pianist or maybe a pre-recorded track, but you definitely don't want a full arrangement at that point. You want to be fluid. And there'll be a kind of an approximation of a musical and an invited audience, and I will solicit feedback. And sometimes I'll get feedback without soliciting it, but above all, I will get to see and hear the show, and my intuitions about pacing and our emotional connection to the characters will either be validated or overthrown. So those have been, for me personally, very useful tools in the developmental process. On one occasion, I was fortunate enough to have my show, The Bully Problem, in an early nascent stage, accepted into the ASCAP Stephen Schwartz musical theater workshop. And this is kind of a fancy version of what I was just describing. You have actors with scripts, and they're on stage, and they're singing, and they're reading their scripts, and it's very static. There isn't a lot of blocking, typically. The difference is you've got 1,000 of your best friends out in the audience, or 500 or however many show up, and a celebrity panel of dramaturgs who, led by Stephen Schwartz, who will then give you feedback in front of the aforementioned crowd. And the process takes a bit of bravery, because they're often quite critical. But for me, the process was invaluable because the feedback I got was stellar. It was supremely useful, and I think it really helped me as I went back to that show and did a second major, maybe it was a third, but a subsequent major rewrite.
So two questions on that note. What is the name of that program? I don't think if that's the right word. What is the name of that, and how do people submit? How can people get their work in there?
I think the name changes depending on who the sponsor is in a given year. I call it the ASCAP Stephen Schwartz Workshop because almost since its inception, he has been the key figure in that workshop, sort of the heart and soul of the workshop. But I would just call it the ASCAP Musical Theater Workshop. I think anyone going to the ASCAP website can find it without difficulty. They, in past years, when there hasn't been a pandemic, would typically run two, usually in the winter or maybe early spring, and there would be one in LA and one in New York. So they would be open to participants from both coasts. You would, I forget what the submission criteria are. I think what they want is a synopsis of your story and a selection of the songs, probably 5 or 6. And you just keep your eye open for the deadline and follow the submission guidelines and send in your best works. What I will suggest as a practical strategy is to remember that they are not asking for the script. They just want a synopsis. So the hint there is really make the songs attention-getting. Really go out of your way to represent your work well. It doesn't necessarily mean spend money, but it does mean spend effort and try to get the best singers you can and the best production on that demo so that when someone who has listened to 200 sets of songs then sleepily picks up yours, they jump out of their seat and say, wow, that's really exciting. So
this isn't written. They want recordings of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, got it. Is there any time that you feel that maybe, as all opinions are subjective, is there any time that you think that some of the advice that you've gotten was just like way off and didn't work, or do you feel like it's always been valuable? Not to question authority or expertise, I'm just curious.
Well, I can look at the ASCAP workshop, which had 3 panelists, one of whom was Stephen. I I thought he gave great advice. The panelist who was there, so Stephen is sort of the panelist. He gives advice on music, lyrics, story, primarily story, but he'll often chime in on the other subjects too. And he'll often have somebody who's maybe a story specialist and then somebody who's a music specialist. Without going into too much detail, I found that the quality of the feedback outside of Stephen varied. But I took what was useful, I set aside what wasn't, and the next draft of my show was much, much better. And that ended up being the produced version. That was the version that we actually took to the Hollywood Fringe and brought to life.
Oh, nice. On that note, so you send in your story synopsis, you send in your songs. When it gets, if it gets selected, then they bring in the rest of the piece, all the dialogue, all the story, or is it still just them just listening to you, just having your songs performed? Am I making sense in that regard? Or do you actually, is the whole entire musical performed?
No, what you typically have done in past years, and this may change from year to year, they're always refining the workshop. And I'm definitely not speaking as a representative of the workshop. I'm just giving you my memories. When we did it, we were told to present about 40 minutes of the show. It didn't have to start at the beginning, but it had to be in sequence. So what they don't want you to do is jumping around and giving you like your show's greatest hits. They want to feel like you're getting continuity. So I think often, but not always, people in the workshop will present the first 40 minutes of their show because that's practically speaking the easiest excerpt to present. There will be a set actors with scripts in hand standing at music stands, and the presenting authors are responsible for the production. So the workshop presents the room and the panelists, and you show up with the talent, and you perform to the best of your ability that excerpt of your show. There's minimal or no blocking, so you don't have to worry about moving your actors, and there's no choreography, and there's no set pieces, and there's no sets, there's no props. Actors might wear clothing or have the occasional handheld prop, but the idea here is to get at the essence of your story and not be distracted by the externalities of the production. So that's how it looks. So you're putting on a show. You're putting on an excerpt of your work.
Got it. Okay. Do you work with beginning talent in regards to, do you workshop with like maybe people that are just starting out? Like for me, like, with I'll get, when I do submissions for like Play Noir, or for the Collegiate Playwright Festival, you get people that they're still trying to find their feet. And you see that, okay, they haven't quite grasped the structure of a story. They don't quite know what they're making certain mistakes that they should at some point overcome. So are there any things that you find that you notice a lot of beginning musical theater people commit?
Well, there's certainly traps that I think beginners fall into. I'm not a festival, and I try to never be a producer. So I'm not someone who typically produces other people's musicals. I'm not like you. I've never been an adjudicator for a festival.
All right, fair enough. But what about if there's people that say, "Oh, hey, do you mind taking a look at this and give me advice because I'm new to this and I don't know?" In that regard.
Sure. If you think of all the rules that I cited earlier, just people are often deviating from them. I often see shows where the music is inactive, meaning it's all reflective. It's all, this thing happened, here's how I feel about that. It's the songs are infrequently moving the story forward. I think that's a common mistake. I think that happens when people take a music first approach often, where they have a vague idea of the story and they write a bunch of songs, and then the story manifests as connective tissue between the songs. And the songs, since the composer wrote the songs without really knowing what was going on, they were all situational reflection, rather than transformative expressions of storytelling. So I think that's a common problem, is not making the music functional, not making it active.
Is it possible to write a musical by doing the music first and then writing the play around it? Or yes, but you just don't. Just it doesn't behoove you to go that route.
I would say it's inadvisable.
Okay.
If in the case of someone who's a single author musical creator, someone who is foolish enough to take on music, book, and lyrics, there may be more of an ability to think forward when you're writing the music. You know, you may actually have the story structure in your head. You may be able to multitask like that. And to be absolutely fair, for certain styles of musical story, if you're doing something that's very impressionistic and kind of a series of moments that's not meant to be a real book musical, you can start with a concept album, you know, just literally record an album and then say, how do I turn this into a review or a succession of songs that are unified by some point of view. But the real answer that I'm dodging around is I don't think you should do that. I think if you start by writing your songs and then figure out the details of the story, you had better be ready to abandon those songs or rewrite them. Because if you dig your heels in because you love your songs, and that is absolutely understandable, like every composer loves their music, you'll be in a bind because you probably won't have the flexibility you need to write a compelling story. You know, you won't be able to rewrite. You won't be able to change the music in a way that the story may need. So what I find is, I said I start with the raw story and not writing songs. In the back of my head, I will allow myself, as I said, the composer side of me will sit on the sidelines and heckle and comment and say, it looks like the story has a lot of interpersonal moments between two characters. The audience might get bored about 30 minutes in. Why don't you think about having a group number there and lay out the infrastructure story-wise so a group number would make sense. I will allow the music side of me to contribute to the story writing side in advance in that kind of general way, just drawing from my intuitions about what we need to see in a musical to stay awake. But that's not quite the same thing as writing songs first. It's just making musically informed story decisions. So
2 questions. And I may go out of order on these because I have to remember the first one that was that popped into my head. How do you approach a group number? We kind of talked about the duets and like between the two characters and whether or not there's conflict between those. That's external, and then we kind of talked about whether or not a solo piece is internal. But what should a group piece do? What's the purpose of that? How does that come into play?
Well, a group number will often have a kind of energy that a solo number may not. A solo number may have intensity and focus, but a group number has breadth because you've just got all these voices and all this energy in the room. You can represent a point of view that many characters have at once, which can offer a kind of power that a single person's expression of opinion might not. So you can have, tradition, or the cowboy and the farmer should be friends, the cowman and the farmer should be friends. You can have these big, it's like a wide shot in a movie, right? As opposed to a close-up shot. That's the real difference. It provides a sense of energy and multiplicity of points of view. And it might, depending on the style of show, it might be an excuse for dance numbers. So it can often wake the audience up from a sheer practical showmanship standpoint. It can provide some dessert when you've just had a kind of a meaningful entree.
Okay. Going back to the other aspect, there's one thing that I don't want to say I have a beef with it. It's my advice in regards to theater in playwriting, where I don't think that you should write, produce, and direct your own work. Would you agree with that when it comes to musicals, that you shouldn't write the music, the book, and the whatever those aspects of musicals are? Do you think you should make it always a collaboration in that regard? Am I being clear?
What an obvious trap you're trying to lay for me. You shouldn't do all three unless you can do all three. There are musicals.
Well, there's some people who think that they can do all three, and usually they wind up kind of shooting themselves in the foot, and that they don't may not realize that especially in LA, I don't think we get honest feedback from our friends necessarily
Right.
when we try to achieve. And so that's why I asked. So I'm not certainly saying that you're not capable, but do you not recommend it?
That's quite a relief. It depends on the individual. I can pull it off. I can do single author shows when I'm writing a story in a domain I feel comfortable with. I tend to write these, so far I've written shows that use science fiction and superhero and fantasy tropes, somewhat comedically, as an opportunity to make commentary on human life in some way and the human condition. That's what I'm good at right now. I may expand my palette in the future, but I've got a firm grasp in that, and I feel capable of writing stories like that, and musical stories where I'm doing all three roles. I would be very cautious if I were doing a musical on a period historic topic. It's just not my area of strength. In that case, I might team up with a book writer and say, you're going to provide the loving attention to details of time and place that I can't do. I also like collaboration. I've had great experience with Greg Crafts, and part of the reason we had so much fun on Super Sidekick is our heads were in the same nerd space. Greg said this on his interview, but we sat down, kind of extended feelers, realized we were both Dungeons and Dragons geeks, and said, yeah, this is going to work just fine. Collaboration is great because it gives you synergy. It lets you have a point of view and ideas that you wouldn't have come up with yourself. It's a great way to diversify what you're doing. The advantage of the single author project is control and a certain kind of agility in that you don't need to negotiate with anyone except your own conscience. So there's advantages to both. I like doing both, and I hope to continue both working collaboratively and on single author projects.
How do you market a musical? And you may have already answered that with the two new musicals incorporated and then the ASCAP one, but are there other ways that you suggest marketing a musical to try and get it out there?
I feel most capable about giving advice when we're looking at the level of a local production. If you ask me how I would market a musical to Broadway, I don't know, I'd hire someone who had done that. But if you're looking at kind of the Hollywood Fringe Festival is a good example, because that's a nice little local market that nonetheless presents marketing challenges as you are trying to bring your show to the attention of audiences, often in a typical year where there's a lot of competition for attention spans, right? So here's what I've come to think after doing this for a few years. One, I guess the most fundamental thing is love your show. Write a musical on a topic you love that engages you and that fills you with motivation. Because if you love your show, other people will sense that. Excitement and enthusiasm will just radiate out from you. You'll be talking to somebody about your show and they'll say, wow, this sounds like they're really into that show. I want to come see it. People will trust you. They'll trust your subconscious evaluation of your own work. If you talk about your show kind of clinically or just passionately, it's not going to engage people in the same way. So suggestion number one is just love what you do. And when you bring something to a marketplace, make sure that it's something you're willing to enthusiastically celebrate. And so many other problems will solve themselves as a side effect of that.
So in that regard, then, because there may not be a lot of, maybe there are a lot of opportunities that I'm just not aware of when it comes to musicals. Do you recommend then self-producing just to kind of get it out there? Or
it may be a necessary first step. I say I aspire to never be a producer and I repeatedly fail. You need to give your musical some kind of workshop and then some kind of premiere production. And if you can ally yourself with a nonprofit, with a theater company, with a producer who will do that work for you, great. Absolutely take advantage of that. If you're in a school environment and you've got academic resources and a theater department that will support you, that's great. If, on the other hand, you want to bring your musical to life and you find some opportunity to do it that's financially sane, produce it yourself. I started with short musicals. I knew that I needed to go through the process in short form before I tackled something big. And this is, 20 years ago at this point, right? I said, I need to get good at this. What can I do? I can write a 10-minute musical and I can produce it in a 10-minute play festival. I found opportunities to do that. And that gave me practical experience, in producing on a small scale, but also in musical writing. It let me go through the process. I was comfortable writing a short musical, and I was comfortable producing a short musical because it's really just a smaller problem by orders of magnitude. So if you can do that, and that's the way your musical can come into existence, then and you can drum up the finances, by all means do it. But it's definitely nice to have somebody else produce your musical.
If you're doing a 10-minute or you're doing the short musical, you're kind of limited, especially if you're in a festival, like you got to really kind of get everything on stage as fast as possible. Do you recommend having pre-recorded tracks for purpose of ease?
That can be a practical approach. The devil's in the details. I think it depends on how much money you have, the size of your venue, and maybe the nature of your music. It doesn't save you as much effort as you might think to work with pre-recorded tracks. It'll definitely save you some effort, and it'll add a predictability to the music, so the cast can memorize the rhythm of the music, and if they can't hear the tracks that well, they can internalize the tempo and kind of stay in sync. But you lose the ability to adapt the music to the nuances of a particular performance. And maybe one night a soloist has a lot of energy and they're going faster and faster. A live band can sense that, or live MD can sense that and convey that to the band, and they can match that energy. On a practical level, if somebody flubs a line or a lyric, they can repeat the phrase or jump ahead as they need to. So there's with a good MD and a good band, there's a kind of robustness of performance, I guess I should say. And but it's expensive, or it can be expensive, and you need a certain amount of room, and the acoustics and sound reinforcement may be very complicated. So it really depends on the situation.
How do you find opportunities to collaborate with playwrights to compose a musical?
Well, outside of educational environments, I think this has only happened twice for me. Early on, when I was just starting out and writing 10-minute musicals, I didn't even trust myself to write the book of a 10-minute musical. Well, that's all right. That's dramatizing a little bit. But I wanted to start as simply as possible. I wanted to musicalize somebody else's short story. So I found a playwright who was a very talented and frequently produced creator of 10-minute plays, Mark Harvey Levine. If you go to a lot of 10-minute play festivals, it is uncommon to not see him somewhere. And I sat down and we said, let's do a 10-minute musical. And he came up with a couple of ideas. I forget if some of them might have been his existing plays and the prospect of musicalizing them, but we came up with this idea. Of the ideas he presented, one of them really struck me as being fruitful for a musical adaptation. And it was a story about a woman who had incredible good luck in every aspect of her life. Nothing like her bills seemed to pay themselves. She seemed to keep winning the lottery. If she had a parking ticket, it would just go away magically. She never watered her plants. Nice. Yeah, it was essentially a charmed life, hence the title of the show. And it turns out that this is all because she has a kind of benevolent stalker, somebody who's been in love with her since they were kids and has kind of creepily followed her through life and has just been making things go right for her, kind of running interference and just being nice to her. So he's the guy who paid off her parking tickets. He's the guy who watered her plants secretly when she wasn't home. It straddles this threshold between devotion and very uncomfortable stalking behavior. This was a comedy, so I think we perceived it as a benevolent kind of creepiness. Sure. So, and then the question of the story is, well, what do you do when you find someone who's so devoted to you, but their entire life has essentially revolved around yours? Can that be the basis of a relationship? What do you do with that? So that was the premise of The Charmed Life. And Mark wrote the play, or I don't remember if it was a pre-existing play or just an idea, but he came up with the book, and I found what moments could be musicalized, and that was my first time really going through this process. The second occasion I had for collaboration, large scale anyway, was with Greg Crafts. And he put out an ad. I think it was The Recycler, but it might have been LiveJournal, but one online forum or another. And I met up with him, and he presented to me this very charming and endearing play, as mentioned, about an assistant superhero who has to step up when his boss is kidnapped. And I immediately saw the musical potential, and also said we kind of felt out each other's personality, and we realized we're both on the same nerd plane, and that collaboration was just kind of off to the races immediately. So sometimes you're lucky, you meet someone that you just click with and everything goes right. And it's just a matter of, your original question, maybe how do you find someone? And I would say the internet is your friend, there are a lot of forums and Facebook groups where people put out composer wanted ads or collaborator wanted ads. I also mentioned New Musicals Inc., which is a educational and developmental organization for musical theater. And they also serve as a kind of, I don't want to say brokerage, but a kind of meeting place for collaborators. And you can reach out to NMI and say, hey, I'm looking for a composer for this project. And they can circulate that notice among the membership, and which includes some very, very talented composers at different levels of experience. So they are a great resource, especially if you're in LA and want to work locally.
Is there... How does it work with compensation when it comes to musical theater? How is that different, or is it different?
Musical theater is a great way to spend money. Making money. I mean, you can take a producing course and learn how things are done at the highest level, and they'll say, there's a percentage of royalties, and it's divided this way among the book writer, composer, and lyricist. You can learn about those structures. I think they tend to be sort of meaningless if you're starting out. The odds of making meaningful income once your expenses are accounted for are minimal. If you have a venue, if you have access to a venue, you have a very popular show at Fringe, you could make $1,000, $2,000 if you have a big enough house and you really market the thing. But you should regard musical theater as, if you want to make money from it, you should regard that as a long-term ambition rather than short-term ambition. You would not want to burden yourself with the stress of financial expectations early on, because the odds of making significant money early are so remote that I think you just stress yourself out.
On that note, though, if you've got somebody who's a playwright and they have written something that they want to be a musical, but they don't have that musical wherewithal, so they have to seek out. I mean, do you just try to find somebody who's willing to do it pro bono in hopes that they can attach themselves to the project?
I think there should be a parity between the participants in the project. If you should have some agreement that says, hey, if we ever make money, we'll divvy it up, but without psychologically burdening yourself with that hope, until your career advances to a point where that is a realistic expectation. If a regional theater is starting to put on your musical and they have an access to an audience, if you have an opportunity for publication, that's a way you can make money through licensing of your shows. Super Sidekick is licensed through Samuel French, now Concord Theatricals, and the show has a life of its own. It gets produced. Greg and I sit back and sort of enjoy the view, and we make some royalties from that. But that took a long time. That was a long process. It wasn't that we just set out to write the show with dollar signs in our eyes. That was a nice, sort of a pleasant surprise at the end of the developmental process.
Sure. Okay. So on that note, how did you go? Because Greg mentioned that story in his episode, but how did that process go about? How did you approach them and say, here's what I've got? And what were those steps?
I'll tell you the details of the path, but I think the principles will be more valuable to others than the details.
Fair enough.
Because everyone's path to their career has nuances that other people just can't reproduce. But I think there are definitely principles that I can share that I hope would be useful for everyone out there. As said, I was writing 10-minute musicals, and I found that Samuel French was running a fairly high-end 10-minute play festival. Not 10-minute, it was a short play festival. Excuse me. I'll give you a little pre-roll. So I discovered that Samuel French was running a high-end short play festival. I think at the time the criteria were your play had to be under 30 minutes. And it was called the Off-Broadway Short Play Festival. And at the time they would produce and stage these plays at the Lion Theater in New York City. It's off Broadway, but it's a good trebuchet shot away from Broadway. You really feel like you're adjacent to the excitement. And some play festivals are of the sort where you mail in your musical and they'll produce it for you and they'll send you pictures and reviews and you don't do any work. And others are what I call the produce it yourself variety, where they give you a venue and marketing and a stage and you show up and you produce your show. So the Samuel French Off-Broadway Festival was in the latter category. And I'm always going to speak in past tense because I don't remember if they're still doing it, and I don't know if it's changed. But as of when I participated, that was the deal. So I thought, I'm in LA, do I want to fly to New York and produce my own show? And I thought, heck yeah, I do. So I got in touch with Bobby Cronin, who is actually a very well-known and respected musical theater composer and lyricist in his own right, but happens to be a great director and music director. And I said, want to direct my show? And he said, sure. And he kind of ran the show literally and figuratively. And he put on, he had a great talent pool, super talented performers. And they performed in 2 successive years, and I think a third year maybe at a different festival. But for the purposes of our story, the relevant part is he produced 2 of my short, 10, 15-minute musicals at the Samuel French Festival. And it was great. I mean, the venue was beautiful. They just ran a really top-notch operation. It was such a great experience. I'm glad I put myself out and dipped into the bank account to make it happen. But what's relevant here is I was not one of the winners of the festival. Each year they would select the finalists. I guess there would be a victor or a number of victors, and they would be published. Samuel French would publish basically a book containing the winning plays. This is not musical theater specific. They would also accept musicals, but they're, I think, primarily oriented towards traditional non-musical plays. So they would put out a book every year, and here's the book of all the plays that won the Off-Broadway Short Play Festival that year, and now you are published by Samuel French. That's literally true, but it also has a kind of prestige value. Sure. So those are the stakes of that festival. That's what made it exciting, the chance of publication. And I lost both times I was in it. But I decided to go to the after party and, kind of be a sporting loser and hang out at the party and talk to people. And I was just in conversation with the literary manager at the time. And she said, I really liked your mini musical. What else are you working on? And I said, I'm developing a 1-hour TYA, family-friendly musical with a co-writer about superheroes. And she said, oop, we like the sound of that. Send us that when you're done. I thought, well, that's interesting. Little did I know that this is kind of the purpose of the Off-Broadway Short Play Festival. It's kind of a talent scouting opportunity for them because they are interested in finding new talent because they're a publisher and they need things to publish. So Greg and I kind of polished the script and we mailed it in. And then we were really excited, dropping that thing in the mail or probably email. But for the sake of storytelling, let's say we dropped it in the mail and watched the postman dramatically ride off into the sunset. And then we just kind of sat by the phone saying, can't wait. And then I think about 2 years went by where nothing happened. And I was trying to keep the faith because I told, I was the one who had met the Samuel French people. To Greg, this was just like this crazy story. So I think, I wouldn't say we lost hope, but our hope entered a somewhat dormant state after a while. And then many months later, I just got this email saying, hey, we loved your show. We want to publish it. So I was at the Game Developer Conference at the time, as one does when one writes music for games. And I just got this email in the middle of the conference. And I was so excited that I think I just zoned out the rest of the conference. Like I was useless. I didn't go to a single talk. I just stumbled around in a daze. And I texted Greg saying, read your email right now. So it was a really exciting moment. So that's the anecdote-strewn story. They published the show, and it's gotten something like 20 productions. I forget if I'm counting the times we produced it ourselves, but it's been produced in places we would never have been able to bring the show to. And some of the productions have been modest, some have been impressively lavish. And it's just been a joy to see the show take on a life of its own and to see all these different interpretations. And yes, it's a cliche, but it's great to see the kids having fun with it. There's a real joy there. So what are the lessons here? Again, the details of my path are kind of idiosyncratic to me, but participate, write things, show up at the after party, even if you didn't win, meet people, have something you're working on. That's a methodology that everyone can adapt to. If you're in LA, participate in the Hollywood Fringe, stage your show there. It's a great environment for doing that because financially it's much more reasonable to produce a musical there than it would be at a traditional theatrical environment. And meet all the people. There's there are two productions of one of my more recent musicals this summer. And one of them is because I was taking a musical theater class with someone who turned out to be a very talented director and choreographer. And we just chatted afterwards. And when I did, I produced the show. This is Gideon and the Blundersnorp, my most recent family musical. And I produced it myself at the Hollywood Fringe last year. And I sent people, we did a video stream and I sent the link to people. And I don't quite remember what the conversation was, but she became interested in it. And that's one of the two productions that's happening this summer. And I didn't, months ago go into that class thinking I'm going to meet a director, that. Well, I was in the class to learn more. But you never know when that magical Brownian motion is going to happen, when you're going to bump against somebody who's going to turn out to be a collaborator. So those are the principles that I think you can pull away from just about every success story in musical theater.
And I want to know your feelings about this because it sounds like it might be something similar, because when we do our call for submissions, we're very niche and we're working on a low budget anyways. So we're trying to find, we try to find playwrights that are just looking to gain to kind of build their resume. So there's not, for the most part, unfortunately, at this moment, because we haven't grown to the extent that we'd like to, there's no compensation. Are you good with that? I mean, do you recommend that with musicals? Look, you're not going to get money, but you've got somebody who's putting their money into it because they believe in it, and it's getting your work staged to hopefully, to build upon something. How do you feel about lack of compensation, but you're getting a production?
I think it's valuable, particularly at the early stages of your career. Whether it's worth doing something for free, it's not a universal question for anyone. It always depends on where you are in your career and what you're getting out of the experience. This question comes up a lot in film scoring circles, where people often have the opportunity to score student films or indie films that are made for people coming out of college, or in game scoring, a student project, or just the first casual game that someone's making. And there's often these heated philosophical debates about should you work for free? And there's no universal answer. You should always get something out of every collaboration. If you're getting your play produced, and it's never been produced before, that is super valuable. You should be very grateful for that if it's a good production. There's no need to hold out, to turn down those opportunities. I think that would be short-sighted. As your career moves along, then you might adjust your financial expectations. You might say, okay, I've been produced X times. I'm going to charge a licensing fee, or I'm going to seek out publication. Your expectations rise as what you're looking for becomes increasingly commercial. Should that happen? That's not necessarily a path anyone needs to take. But if you stick to the principle that you should get something valuable out of every experience, you will not go wrong.
Okay. Because we've talked about musical theater and all the goodness behind it, how do you approach children's musicals or young adult musicals opposed to something that you would write for adults or something that's more mainstream? What's the difference? Is it more simple? Do you stick to the same guidelines, or is it just one and the same?
Well, naturally, a story and lyrics, I think, have to be age-adjusted for younger audiences.
I like that. Say that again.
Age-adjusted.
Age-adjusted. I got age-adjusted. I'm like, I like that. I like that combination.
I think in practical terms, your lyrics will tend to be more concrete and less abstract because kids and young adults won't necessarily have the body of experiences that an adult would have. If an 8-year-old listens to the Sondheim song "Every Day a Little Death," they're not going to immediately say, "Oh, that is the slow attenuation of the human soul in an unsatisfying romantic relationship." They're going to think, "What, is someone being tortured to death?" Right? So you have to be more concrete, more literal, and have digestible imagery. And there are similar burdens in the story. Obviously, the story has to make sense. And as you go into true children's theater, you just have to keep the realities of their attention and attention span firmly in mind, because they will doze off and they will turn to mommy and say, "I want to go home." And they will talk to your cast members on stage and tell them to do different things that are scripted. I've had all of those things happen, by the way. Those are not hypothetical examples. You want to write a story that's robust for that kind of audience experience. With Super Sidekick, we often would have contributions from the audience. And, in casting, you want to get someone who can roll with those punches and maybe engage with the audience a little bit, because that's fun for that kind of show.
When you write for the kids, do you make it interactive, or do you just let it happen if it's
going to happen whether you like it or not? I think in Super Sidekick, Greg did put in a few moments of fourth wall shattering where you turn to the audience and solicit some opinions. I tend to do that less, but the younger you go, the more collaborative that audience is going to be.
Do you think that somebody needs to, if they're going this route, if they're going musical route, do you think it's necessary to go through a program, like through academic program or anything to that extent?
Well, it's probably a good idea, though the answer really differs depending on the person's self-education and experience. I can imagine people who just were steeped in the theater from a young age, are very familiar with the musical theater literature, were writing from a young age, and you can be an autodidact. For me, what I found was useful, and I might suggest this to most people, is I started by getting my feet wet. I started by writing 10, 15-minute musicals. I produced a bunch of them. I got some firsthand experience. And then I sought out an opportunity to refine my skills based on having had some experience thus far. I thought, okay, let's make my technique, let's bring it up to the level of my ambitions. What I found in LA was the aforementioned organization New Musicals, Inc., which runs a core curriculum every year, which is a series of lectures and collaborative projects. You go in as either a composer, a book writer, or a lyricist, or if you're really masochistic, you can decide to be more than one. But each one of those choices brings with it a set of assignments and collaborative responsibilities, and you collaborate with other students, and you write songs, and eventually you write a 10 to 15-minute musical as the culmination of the project. And NMI is now online compatible. They have a lot of participants from around the world, so you don't have to be in LA anymore. And indeed, it didn't really matter during the pandemic because everything was remote. But I went through that organization. I went as a lyricist because I felt like that's where I most needed to bone up in terms of my technique. And it was profoundly helpful, learning some of the, I'll call it theory, and some of the sort of the book knowledge about lyrics, which really borrows from poetry a little bit, poetry studies. It made me a much better lyricist, without question. You can look at the writing I did before and after that educational stint, and you can see it's profoundly better from a technical standpoint after I went through NMI's program. So I can recommend them highly, and I'm not just saying that because I'm the current member representative of that organization. I do sincerely believe they offer a profoundly valuable educational experience. They are not at all the only game in town. NYU at Tisch offers a graduate musical theater program, which is highly renowned. The BMI Musical Theater Workshop has been around since I think the 60s, and that offers a similar collaborative experience. There are a number of programs that are usually a mixture of theory and practice that will help you learn what you need to know. And some kind of education is probably not a bad idea.
You mentioned theory. What does that entail, or is that just that's such a deep, layered aspect that it's really hard to give an answer to that?
Right. No, I agree completely. And the answer differs between music, lyrics, and book writing.
Fair enough.
when you think of book writing, it's a lot of what you know as a playwright. You
Right.
understand the importance of character motivations and strong arcs and decisions. Those things tend to be even more true in musicals. That's kind of what I mean by theory where story is concerned. With lyrics, there's a lot of technical understanding about prosody, about perfect rhyme, about meter, about the different forms a song can manifest lyrically. The idea of a lyrical progression, of how lyrics develop an idea across a song, not typically something that's done in pop music, but which is very important in musical theater. And where music is concerned, of course, you've got traditional musical theory, you've got harmony, you've got knowledge of different genres, musical form. You've got everything you would normally study in music theory for instrumental music. So all of that is something that is useful to know in the endeavor of musical theater creation, though it's also worth knowing that Irving Berlin couldn't read music. So talent also goes a long way.
Is there I'm going to say genre of music that you don't think can be implemented in musicals?
All these challenges you're laying out for me. No, I mean, I think certain genres of music lend themselves to different stories. I think that's generally true. Rock musicals, the more successful ones, have had a kind of melodramatic quality involving mythical, larger-than-life characters. I think the most successful rock musicals have had that quality because the music lends itself to that. Hip-hop is surprisingly versatile when it comes to for musical storytelling because it's such a verbal, lyrical medium. It's so word-heavy, and we are used to hearing rapid-fire, lots of detailed lyrics in hip-hop, so you can really convey a lot of information in a short period of time. I think that worked to Hamilton's advantage because that's a story about the Secretary of the Treasury. There's a lot of historical detail, and if all of it were sung as opposed to rapped, I mean, the show would be like 8 hours long. Like hip-hop can move quickly. There's a lot of room for debate, and there's a lot of fun juxtaposition of styles of music counterintuitively to stories that don't seem to go for that style of music. You can have a lot of fun in trying styles of music and applying them in unexpected ways. But I couldn't say that any particular style of music could never be applied to a musical with some creativity.
On that note, would all of the things that we've talked about today still apply no matter what genre of music you used?
I have to remember everything I've said, which puts me under a lot of pressure. But
the principles and making sure that, like, if you're doing a hip hop song or you're doing an operatic piece, if you decide you're going to write an opera, all of those things that you touched on would still apply as far as like it has to be an emotional thing. It has to be a struggle. It has to be in that regard. It's what I mean. All of those things still apply.
For every experimental musical that breaks the mold and does something remarkably different, you'll have 100 musicals that stick to the formula. And where innovation is concerned, it typically involves musical innovation, or maybe a story idea, like Come From Away, right? Musically, it's very conservative, but it's such an interesting idea for a story. So I think that's where that show was particularly innovative. The principles of storytelling in musical theater, I think, are consistent across genres. And if you look at Hamilton, which was groundbreaking in a way, it followed in the heights in being kind of a mainstream application of hip hop to musical theater. But Hamilton kind of plays by the rules. It kind of follows most of the traditional principles of musical theater and how the songs function. It's what's striking is the musical style and the premise of the show and the setting and the interracial casting and all these interesting elements of the production. But if you distill it down to its essence, I think where it works, it's fairly traditional.
What do you know now that you wish you knew when you first started out?
Start with the book. Start with the story. Don't just start writing music and hope it'll all work out, because that's gambling a lot on luck.
Where can people find your work, and how can they get in touch with you?
My home base on the web is mikemusic.com. And it's just one word, Mike and music squashed together. And there's links to everything there. There are also websites, and then, by the way, that website also covers my instrumental _ my game music, my film music, so it's kind of everything crammed into one bit of web property. My individual musicals have their own websites, so if you're curious about Super Sidekick, you can go to supersidekickthemusical.com. If you want to check out Gideon and the Blundersnorp, my most recent show, that's gideonmusical.com. And The Bully Problem, my second to most recent musical, is thebullyproblem.com. I'm on all the social media places you'd expect. Just search for Michael Gordon Shapiro and I'll pop up.
Well, Michael Gordon Shapiro, thanks for coming into this Playwright Spotlight.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Playwright Spotlight. Again, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below. And even if it's just say hi, if you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. And in the meantime, and until we meet again, keep writing.